Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our third RECONNECT virtual roundtable in our fall 2020 webinar series, entitled 4 Years Later, Trumpism, the Rule of Law, and the 2020 US Presidential Elections. We're very happy to welcome back to our webinar series two leading legal scholars specializing in constitutional systems in distress and rule of law backsliding. Professor Kelemen Scheppele, Lawrence S. Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton University, and Professor Dan Kelemen, Professor of Political Science and Law and German Chair in European Union Politics at Rutgers University. So today we'll be discussing some of the key questions surrounding the state of democracy and the rule of law in the United States. Looking at questions like what kind of damage has been dealt to democracy and the rule of law in the US, as well as democracy promotion, and what may be its long-term effects. What kinds of vulnerabilities do they reveal in the US system of checks and balances? And also, how does this compare to parallel trends that we observe within the EU, of course? And what does this tell us about the state of democracy as a system of government? We will also look to the elections, of course, and to the future, and so what kind of steps need to be taken to strengthen and protect democracy and the rule of law in the United States. In the latter part of this webinar, we will be taking questions from the audience, so please write to me through the GoToWebinar chat box. We very much look forward to your questions. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to Professor Dan Kelemen, who will give us an initial overview of the issues at stake. You have the floor.
Thanks, Alex. So I'm not actually going to say too much initially about sort of what Trump has tried to do or his overall assault. I think we're all pretty familiar with that, reading the papers. He's clearly an aspiring authoritarian, though not an entirely successful one, at least not yet anyway. He's attacked the rule of law in the US. He's attacked the legitimacy of American elections. He's attacked really the idea of pluralist democracy itself. And again, we can in the Q&A get to sort of more of the details on what he's done, but I want to specifically address the questions that Alex had put to us about what this kind of assault that has been waged by Trump and by his enablers in the GOP, what it's revealed about the US system, about its vulnerabilities, what damage it has done so far, and then I'm going to sort of hand things over to Kim Scheppele, my friend Kim from Princeton, who is going to talk more specifically about the election. But let's start with the question, one of the questions Alex put to us about what are the vulnerabilities, or what vulnerabilities have Trump's attacks on democracy revealed about the vulnerabilities in the US system of checks and balances, okay? Now, I want to start us out a little, go back to the beginnings, Federalist 51, right, where Madison wrote the following: in the compound Republic of America, the power is surrendered by the people, is first divided between two distinct governments, and then the portion allotted to each is subdivided among the distinct and separate departments. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different governments will control each other, and at the same time, each will be controlled by itself. So I want to talk a bit about that double security that he had in mind, because really the double security is in essence the combination of separation of powers, which is what most people think of when they think of checks and balances, but also federalism, okay, which can serve as that second kind of check on tyranny. Well, so let's kind of go through each of the checks and balances and think about how they've done. How has the legislative branch done as a check on this rogue executive? Well, essentially we've seen that party trumps institution, right? So on the one hand, Republicans in the legislative branch have been in total dereliction of their duty to be a check on the executive. They can continually enable Trump's overreach, and they refuse to stand up to him, with the rare exception of someone like Mitt Romney, but essentially the rest of the entire GOP in Congress just enables Trump. So in that respect, the legislature has failed as a check on the executive in the US system. That being said, I think it's important, to recognize that because there are separate elections for the legislature and the executive and midterm elections, that meant that the Democrats were able in the midterms to get control of at least the House. And so that from their position in the House, they have been a bit of a check on Trump, at least in terms of their control over the budget. So, while, for instance, we weren't able to remove him from office because of his defenders in the Senate, the Republican-controlled Senate, at least, the impeachment hearings, there was a vote of impeachment in the House. That shows some check from the legislative branch. So not a total failure, but inadequate. How about the judiciary? Well, the judiciary, I think it's been a mixed bag. On the one hand, the judiciary has put up some important impediments to Trump. So on things like his Muslim ban or the use of military funds for the border wall, federal courts, have stopped some of Trump's initiatives. But the Supreme Court, has not fulfilled that sort of duty because, of course, the Supreme Court is controlled by GOP-appointed judges, and more generally, I think we've seen that there are real limits to what the judiciary can do. In particular, because Trump has politicized prosecution through his control of the DOJ and putting in place now, with Barr leadership at the DOJ that is basically acting more like his personal attorney than the defender of the rule of law in the US. And essentially, what's been underscored is that a sitting president is kind of untouchable. He can commit crimes, and unless you have a majority to remove him in the legislature, the judiciary can't ultimately hold him accountable for his crimes. So having said that about the legislative and judicial branches, I would move on to federalism, which I think has actually been the most important of the checks. And there's some irony here. And I'm going to come back to this when I talk about the EU, because of course in American history, federalism enabled authoritarianism at the state level for like a century after the Civil War. Pockets of single party autocratic regimes in the US South were able to survive precisely because of federalism. And federalism became a kind of synonym for, if you were defending federalism in those days, you were defending racist Southern regimes. And again, now we're seeing that federalism, has problematic side, the way we see voter suppression efforts in Georgia, Texas, etc. That being said, there's the flip side of federalism. So there's the problems, but then there's also where it can be a check on the president, because essentially, as much as he would want to, Trump can't rig all the elections because elections are run by states. He has no leverage, no control in places like California, New York, New Jersey, many, many more, right? So we see that while federalism can enable pockets of autocracy at a subnational level, it can also stand in the way of an aspiring autocrat seizing total power at the national level, okay? Now, what damage has all this done to US democracy and also to US efforts at democracy promotion worldwide? That was the next question that Alex had put to us. And I would say, look, the damage to US democracy has been profound. I mean, just look at the ratings bodies, which I often point to in the EU context, and Hungary and Poland. Well, look at the US. Freedom House has the Freedom House scores for the US have significantly declined. Back in 2009, US had a score of 94 out of 100 in Freedom House, near the top, just behind Germany, Switzerland. Since then, we've slipped more than 8 points. I think that was as of 2019. There's many of the same pressures that we see worldwide on things like electoral integrity, judicial independence, corruption. Those same kind of problems, are problems here in the US. And Americans realize this. There was a poll last year by the Democracy Project, and it's an organization called the Democracy Project, and they found that a majority, 55% of Americans thought US democracy was weak, and 2/3 thought it's getting weaker. So this is perceived by the population, and there's a wide sense of fear about the fate of our democracy. Now, how about democracy promotion and the US's longstanding policy of promoting democracy worldwide? Well, look, Trump has embraced dictators. He's undermined democracy at home. So in short, we have zero credibility on the world stage, zero in promoting democracy. This is a gift to Xi, it's a gift to Putin, it's a gift to autocrats worldwide. Now, if Biden wins, of course, I think we can expect him to try to resuscitate U.S. democracy promotion policy. He has a lot of plans. He's called for a summit of democracies. Some people are talking about elevating this, what's called D10 or the Democratic 10 format of sort of international summits in a way as a, let's say, a different combination than the traditional G7 that people focus on. So, there are ideas about the U.S. taking leadership and promoting democracy again. But I do think we'll have to do it henceforth with more humility than we did in the past, which might not be a bad thing. All right, now the sort of last question or two, and Alex, you can, let's see, do I have 5 minutes left, Alex? Maybe you're muted, so I'll just keep talking.
Go ahead, it's fine.
Okay, yeah. You had asked me, Alex, or asked us to address how do these developments in the US parallel trends we observe in the EU, and what does that tell us about the state of democracy as a system of government? Well, let me say something about sort of common background trends and then institutional differences. It's some of the same background factors, some of the same impetus has been behind the anti-democratic movements in both Europe and the US, certainly. And we see that, a lot of people have written scholarly analyses of this, where there's reaction against mounting inequality, a kind of reaction by people who see themselves as the victims of globalization, social change, immigration, sort of less educated whites or natives, if you want to call them that, in European countries, where they are essentially worried about status maintenance, and they are willing to embrace, in many cases, these increasingly authoritarian leaders. Okay? So that's going on both sides, but I'd say institutionally, kind of to come back to my federalism point, what we see is the main difference between the US and EU is that today, although there are big problems at the state level, don't get me wrong, in places like Georgia or Texas, where we see you may have seen yesterday, the massive lines, some people waiting 10 hours to vote in Georgia. So there's massive democratic problems at the state level. But that being said, the principal threat right now to democracy in the US is at the federal level or the national level. Whereas in the EU, the principal threats to democracy are at the member state level, right? So from regimes like those in Hungary or Poland, increasingly Bulgaria and others, right? So, while people talk about the democratic deficit, which is a real problem in the EU, the real threats to democracy, are coming more from national capitals. And I guess the last thing I'd say about the parallel is that on both sides of the Atlantic, I think the real threat, the biggest threat to democracy, or where these anti-democratic forces can succeed, is where mainstream democratic forces enable them, right? So it's where you have, the craven GOP, and including people like Lindsey Graham, who had said Trump was unfit for office and all that sort of thing. Once he's in power, then they embrace him, right? They're the real danger. It's always the enablers more than the autocrats that I fear. And the same in the EU, where you have these autocratic figures, but they could never succeed without mainstream politicians enabling them. So in the EU case, the equivalent of the craven GOP is the craven EPP, European People's Party, for instance, that has enabled Orban for years. Now, I have a lot of ideas. You had asked us too about steps taken to strengthen and protect American democracy, but I think it'd make more sense maybe to pass things on to Kim to talk about the election, and then in the context of the Q&A, I can talk about a lot of these ideas of how we could repair American democracy, everything from abolishing the Electoral College to getting rid of the filibuster to passing a new Voting Rights Act. But why don't we come back to that in the Q&A?
Sounds great, Dan, and thank you so much for kind of bringing into focus how these two key aspects of checks and balances, federalism on the one hand and division of powers within the constitutional system, how they play into kind of strengths and weaknesses of the United States when it comes to democracy and the rule of law. And of course, the very interesting parallel with what is taking place in the European Union, of course. Perhaps another area we can go back to in the discussion. Now, it's my great pleasure, of course, to give the floor to Kim.
Great, thank you. And can you all see my slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, great. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the election itself because the American election is 3 weeks off. Most of us in the United States are incredibly anxious about this election. And I want to explain something about sort of how the American electoral system works, why it was in trouble before Trump and why Trump has magnified the differences. I'm trying to change my slides here. So 3 weeks from today is the US election. And while everybody's focused on the presidential part, because of the way that power rotates in the US, 1/3 of the seats in the upper house, the Senate, are also up for grabs, and all of the seats in the House of Representatives, because those are only 2-year terms, plus there are state races, plus there are local races, and then in many areas there are so-called ballot questions where one group or another will put, concrete like constitutional amendments or certain fundraising kinds of initiatives onto the ballot. This year, 1/3 of the Senate seats are up for election, and right now, of course, as Dan mentioned, the Republicans control the Senate. But this is a very bad year for Republicans in terms of the Senate races they have open. This is a map of the U.S. The blue states are the kind of solidly Democratic states. The solid red are the Republican-held seats that they're expected to keep. But all the states that are in cross, hatches there are ones that are competitive, which is to say that they could go either way. And you'll see on the map that there are tons more Republican competitive seats than Democratic competitive seats. And if the Democrats pick up 4 seats, 4 of those crosshatch seats, then they will be in a majority in the Senate, which is, I think, what now many people are hoping for in order to combat some of the problems we've seen in the last 4 years. There's also, this is a map of the House of Representatives districts. Now, when you look at this, what you'll see is the sea of red. The problem with the sea of red is that a lot of where that red is, meaning Republican districts, are where there are hardly any people. That's why, whole states will have sort of 1 representative, and all the blue districts are sort of clustered along the coast and in some liberal areas in the middle of the country. But even with that map that looks like a sea of red, the anticipated result of this election is that the Democrats will win the House of Representatives. And this map tells you safe, and the bluer or the redder a district is, the more likely it is to stay in the hands it's presently in, and otherwise you see some states that are leaning. But the expectation is that the Democrats will keep their majority in the House. But everyone's focused on the presidential election. And in this is the map this morning from the website 538, which is the one that most of us go to see all kinds of analyses of the polls. Right now, Biden is ahead of Trump by about 10 points, which is huge in presidential election terms. Normally, that's landslide territory. And if we had a sane and sensible election system where every person gets 1 vote and it counts equally, you would think there wouldn't be any chance that Trump would win. But the American election system is rickety, and it was rickety before we got to Trump. So Trump, seeing that he may lose, probably will lose, has been getting out in advance and trying to, among other things, cast doubt on the integrity of the election. He has been whipping up charges of voter fraud, that there are going to be all kinds of fake people, illegal immigrants, all kinds of, ballots that will be thrown into the system by foreign governments. He's raised a whole series of kind of questions about the balloting, and that if he loses, he's going to say it was because the election was rigged. If it were just Trump saying this, we wouldn't be so worried, but this is a little chart that shows you the percentage of people in each of these categories who who are not confident or not at all confident that the election will be free and fair. Okay, so the Republicans, majorities of Republicans, believe already that the election will not be free and fair, which is where Trump kind of, he's been whipping up this sentiment for some time. So if Trump loses, this is really poised to generate, well, some people are saying even violence in the streets. This has been compounded by the fact that Trump has said that he refuses to commit, if he loses, to having a peaceful transfer of power. There was this press conference on the 23rd of September where he said, and it's really quite remarkable, right? We're going to have to see what happens. He's asked, like, will you commit to a peaceful transfer of power? And just think about the world in which that question is a sensible question to ask, right? He says, we're going to have to see what happens. I've been complaining very strongly about the ballots, and the ballots are a disaster. Get rid of the ballots and you'll have a very peaceful, well, there won't be a transfer, frankly, there'll be a continuation. Which is to say that that sort of indicates that he's planning to stay in power, even if he loses. And here too, his supporters back him up. What I'm really stunned by is this figure on the bottom right here, where almost 40% of Republicans think that Trump is right to avoid saying that he will peacefully transfer power if he loses, before he sees what the results are. Which is to say, his supporters are right there with him, you know, backing up his claim that maybe a peaceful transfer of power would not be a good idea. So this is the world that we're in. And, you know, unfortunately, this is something where we could have foreseen this happening, because the American election system was rickety even before we got to this point. And there are two main reasons. You know, one is that voters don't elect the president, presidential electors do. And the second, sort of Dan hinted at that, and also this other point, that the US presidential election is not really a national election. It's 50 state elections, each with their own rules, and the 50 state elections are added up. And that puts a kind of uncertainty into the system that makes it actually hard to say for certain that even with a 10-point lead, Biden is going to win. So let me tell you a couple of features of the American electoral system. We have this thing called the Electoral College, which was invented at the end of the 18th century. This is a picture of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And the Electoral College was considered a kind of genius invention, because at that time there was a real question of how you would elect a president. So no country on earth had a general popular vote for president in 1787. In fact, few had elected presidents at all. And there was a conviction in the Philadelphia Convention that whenever there was disagreement about how you would transfer powers from the already existing states to a national government, where there was disagreement, matters were left to the states. And there was a huge amount of disagreement over what the qualifications would be for voters, how electors for the president would be chosen. In the face of all that disagreement, basically almost all the rules for the national elections were left to the states. Now, the delegates of the convention believed that power sprang from its source. So whoever put someone in power would be the institution or the people to whom the office holder would owe allegiance. And the worry with the president is that he would owe his allegiance to some faction or other, right? And so the Electoral College was a neat trick for solving this problem. So they were worried, first of all, about corruption in the election. And even though we call this thing the Electoral College, it has no campus, it doesn't even meet in one place. Instead, the electors for each state go to their state capitals and cast their votes on the same day. And in the late 18th century, it was sort of thought to be impossible to corrupt a system where there were these separate ballots happening in lots of different locations. Moreover, the tricky thing about the Electoral College is that it votes to elect a president, and then as soon as its role is over, it dissolves itself. So by the time the president comes to office, he's not dependent on some standing body that just put him in place. So at the time, that was considered a kind of genius move. Now, this is the language of the original Constitution about the Electoral College. And it says, and this is going to be important this year, I think, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors, and it's equal to the size of the congressional delegation, Senate and House. And then it says Congress may determine the time of choosing the electors, et cetera. Okay, so the system for picking presidential electors is in the hands of the states, and the electors shall meet in their respective states. So once these electors are chosen, as the legislature determines, then the electors meet, and this is the whole language of this, the Electoral College was amended almost immediately because it ran into trouble. That's another story. But this is the crucial thing. So when the electors meet, if they vote by a majority of the electors appointed to elect a president, then that's the person. That's the system we typically have. But if no person has a majority in the Electoral College, then it kicks the matter over to the House of Representatives, which shall choose the president. So then you think, okay, well, look, Biden's ahead. That's, probably we're going to get a popular vote for Biden. It goes to the House of Representatives. The current House of Representatives has a Democratic majority. And then there's the line of succession. Hang on, this is explaining the system, sorry. But here's the problem. Okay, what happens if the election is thrown to the House of Representatives? According to the Constitution, it says that every member of Congress every member of the House doesn't get a vote. Instead, every state votes and gets one vote. Okay, so then you look at who has a majority of representatives in each state, and the House majority, overall majority, if every member of the House gets one vote, turns into a Republican majority, which is to say 26 states have more Republicans than Democrats in their state delegation to Congress. And if this thing goes into chaos and gets kicked over to the House, the Republicans will vote for Trump. So this is one of the things that we're worried about. Now, there's a couple of things about this. If they can't reach any decision at all in this process, then they go into, like if on January 20th, when power is supposed to be transferred, if there is no person who has been appointed, then you go through the Succession Act. And then if there's no president and no vice president, the next person in line is Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and you can imagine the Republicans want to prevent that. So that's one of the issues. Now, the Electoral College is a bit of the Electoral College now has 2 out of the last, 6 elections, given the presidency to somebody who did not win the popular vote. And this is the problem. So this is a little map that shows you all of the states in the United States that have a smaller population than the county around Los Angeles, which is here in red. And so the problem is that the current Electoral College is stacked in favor of Republicans because there's this whole great middle of the United States, which you saw in that House map, where every state gets 2 senators, and some of these states only have 1 member of Congress. So as a result, their votes are weighted more in the Electoral College, and all those states are now Republican states, pretty solidly Republican states. So what many people estimate now is that there's a Republican bias in the Electoral College of about 3 to 5%, which means that that a Democratic candidate would have to win at least 3, more comfortably 5, and only assuredly 7% more of the popular vote to win in the Electoral College. It's a structural thing that sort of guarantees a Republican edge. And with very close elections, this bias in the Electoral College settles the election, as we saw with Trump himself in 2016. Now, the Electoral College puts in place a kind of calendar, which is going to start, the clock is going to start ticking, and all of these deadlines are going to be crucial for figuring out, what kind of mischief can Trump cause this year. So Election Day is November 3rd. Lots of people are voting already. There's a window for ballots to be counted, which is pretty generous. But if states finish their counting and if they certify their electors by the 8th of December, this is called a safe harbor date. It means that the state's choices of their electors will be respected and cannot be overturned by Congress or in any later procedure. Now, if the count keeps going past the 8th of December, then there can be challenges mounted to the choice, including in the House of Representatives if and when the decision gets kicked over to them. The 14th of December is when the Electoral College meets and votes. One possibility here is that there may not be electors certified from several states, at which point there may not be a majority of electors. There's a lot of complicated legal arguments here, but the general view is that the person who wins the presidency has to get 270 Electoral College votes. And if there are a number of states that are still tied up in challenges, they may not be certified to get even an obvious winner to that number, right? So the Electoral College could be all gamed this year by a lot of late certifications and chaos in the states. The Electoral College then delivers its results to Congress. 6th of January, joint session of Congress opens and counts the electoral votes. And if one candidate didn't get 270 votes, then the House of Representatives makes its choice of the president. Okay, so this, you're going to be hearing these dates as we go along, because a lot of us have the feeling that November 3rd is not going to decide the election. And this year the president has every incentive to prevent the results from being certified. He's already said he doesn't want to honor the results of the popular vote. Okay, so how can he gum up the works? Okay, well, and this is where we get to part 2, and I'll speed through some of this. Like I said, at the Constitutional Convention, the determination was that every state would set its own rules, including for national elections. And this is just a couple of examples. On the left, that's actually a map of the US with every state kind of looking the same, but every state has different options for voting ahead of November 3rd in person. So some states have early voting, some states have what's called in-person absentee, where you can go to the election commission and fill in an absentee ballot in front of them, which sort of feels like voting, but it isn't. Some states allow you to mail in ballots, which are counted before the election, and some don't let you go at all. On the right, what you see are, if you want to vote by mail, and of course during the pandemic, a lot of people now don't want to show up at the polling places. The purple states are the ones where everybody has gotten a ballot in the mail. I'm in New Jersey, one of those little purple states, and I got my ballot. In fact, I'm taking it in today. In all the orange states, you can just write in and say, I want an absentee ballot. You don't have to give a reason. But in the green states, you have to use one of a set of reasons. I am disabled, I am sick, I will be out of state, or something like that. And New York State recently changed one of its reasons to being, I don't want to go because of the virus. But in a number of these other states, the virus doesn't count as a reason. Okay, so there's not necessarily mail-in ballots. Now, here's the issue. It turns out when you look at surveys, Democrats believe the pandemic is real, and mostly they're laying low. And Republicans, as you can see from Trump and his supporters at the rallies, kind of think the virus is a hoax, and they want to vote in person. So for the first time, you really see this opening up. Here you've got half of Democrats are going to vote by mail. But if you add in-person election in person early, 80% of Republicans are going to show up and vote in person. Okay, so what that means is that it's worth it for the Republicans to challenge all the mail ballots because that's how they can get them not counted, distrusted, and so on. All right, so how is that working? Well, under Trump, the post office has been weaponized. So in May, Trump appointed one of his major campaign donors to head the post office. The new postmaster general instructed a bunch of the automatic mail sorting machines to be thrown away, which means now all this mail has to be sorted by hand. And at the same time, he stopped overtime payments so workers can't stay longer to sort the mail. And this has generated a slowdown of mail just in general. And in August, 46 states were told that the post office could not guarantee that mail ballots would be returned on time, given when the states, electoral officials were going to be sending out the ballots. So 50% of Democrats want to vote by mail, and the post office is not going to work. Okay. And you might just say, well, that's just a coincidence, right? So these are areas this is a map that shows you the blue circles are places where Hillary Clinton kind of won in 2016, where you can expect there to be a lot of Democratic ballots. And the red circles show you where all the automatic mail sorters were removed, which is to say exactly in these districts. So the post office can't be trusted. All right. In addition, hundreds of lawsuits are now pending before the election. There's this great website, the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project. I downloaded this yesterday. There are still 365 pending cases that challenge the rules already in effect. Okay. And a lot of the cases look like this first one. This is one where, and there's also an identical one in Texas. All of the electoral officials, by the way, are partisan. So you get elected to be the head of the election operation in the state. And in both Ohio and Texas, there are Republican secretaries of state. In both those cases, the Republican secretaries of state, again, remember the Republicans want to suppress the mail ballots. they decided to put only one drop box per county. Now, a drop box is where you can go and put your ballot knowing that it will get to the election office. So that way you bypass the mail. And, in Texas, there are counties that are 1,000 square miles, and ditto in Ohio. So now there are lawsuits challenging the one drop box per county rule. And that's all pending. And the election's 3 weeks off. So these are still, being litigated. And today's outrage, this is then the news this morning here, is that in California, which is again a Democratic state, nobody doubts that it's going to go for Biden, but they want to lower the vote so that it looks like the popular vote is tracking the Electoral College vote, if that's different. And so the California Republican Party went out overnight and started putting out fake drop boxes. There's the fake drop boxes here on the bottom right, the official ballot boxes on the upper left. And so what they're actually encouraging is voters to vote in a ballot box where all those ballots can be challenged because they're not being returned in one of the certified ways. And it's the California Republican Party that admits to having done it. So, this is going to generate litigation as well. This is in addition to the fact that even before Trump and even before all these dirty tricks that we're seeing in the current election, the US Supreme Court has, since the Reagan years, voted in favor of the Republican position on every single voting rights case that comes before it. And basically we've had now for 40 years a system in which Republicans win by suppressing the vote and Democrats win by getting out the vote. So Republicans have put in place laws that say you have to show a state-issued voter ID. We're a country that doesn't have state-issued voter IDs for everybody. So some people don't have them, and those people are disproportionately Democratic voters. Anyone who's committed a felony, even when they're out of jail, gets, in many states cannot vote. There's a current battle in Florida because Florida voters voted to give felons who had served their prison time back the vote. And then the state legislature passed a law that says, yes, but only if they pay all their fines and fees. And then the state can't tell people what fines and fees they owe. So that's like 1 million people. So anyway, they're voter roll purges. So the secretaries of state who were partisan elected officials go through and just knock people off the voter rolls. And remember, we don't have universal voter registration. So you have to go and register to vote. And between the last election and this one, your name could have disappeared. And, anyway, and then we have this problem of voters bringing guns to polling places. And so this is the wild card that a lot of us fear. And I'm going to end with this. Trump has been giving signals to a lot of heavily armed private militias to say there's going to be massive mail ballot fraud. There's going to be massive fraud at the polls. He told one group like this to, stand back but stand by and wait for the election. Trump is putting out this message that his armed militia folks should turn up at the polls. And moreover, there actually now is a system for recruiting armed federal officials to go out to the state polls to ensure that voting proceeds regularly. But of course, it's all coming from the right-wing side of the electoral spectrum. So a lot of us are really worried about this election. And you could see that the system was broken before we got here and that Trump's people have made it worse. So you're going to be hearing a lot more of this election, not only up until the election date, but even thereafter. So, oops, thanks. Let me stop my file share. Are you still seeing my? Okay. So you're not seeing my screen anymore, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you so much for giving this very fascinating and highly informative, kind of detailed overview of kind of the intricacies of US electoral law and kind of the perfect storm that this, in combination with the COVID pandemic, of course, but also the attempts at voter suppression and so on and so forth by the Trump administration, and kind of all the uncertainties that it raises for the upcoming elections. Now, we already have some questions from the audience who would like to remind to send us questions through the webinar chat box, as we will be soon moving on to the Q&A. And perhaps before we kick off the Q&A, kind of a question that comes to mind listening to both of your interventions is, you know, how much is this new? How much is this kind of a recent development, or when it comes, and also broadening the scope beyond the elections themselves, when it comes to, you know, the protection and promotion of human rights and civil rights, both within and outside the country. Is it perhaps fair to say that despite the United States being, you know, recognized as the greatest democracy in the world, perhaps the US has not been a democracy for many, and especially when we look again at voting suppression, when we look at how there's been a tendency, some would argue, since the Nixon presidency to kind of progressively centralize government and give a more and more prominent role to the president, and perhaps how these trends have in many ways come to a head, both with Trump and with the pressures that come with a global pandemic. So perhaps you could tell us something more about that, and then we can move to the questions from the audience.
I can say something quickly on that, just very quickly. Yeah, look, these problems are, of course, not new. You know, if you go back in American history, I mean, I'd say America was not a democracy until the passage and implementation of the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, right? Because it's not just that there was awful racism in, you know, post-Reconstruction U.S., which of course there was, but that racism really amounted, you know, to autocracy in these southern states because, you know, they did not have free and fair elections. There was systematic suppression of the vote, and so, you know, so we can maybe say that the period, you know, since the late 60s, early 70s till recently was, you know, maybe the high point, despite all the problems that existed of American democracy, and now we're sliding back again with more problems mounting. I guess the other thing I'd say is, you know, many of the institutional features that Kim discussed, you know, have been there all along, right, and been problematic. You know, and other things like, let's say, like the role of the Senate as a sort of counter-majoritarian body. But these problems have become more intense recently, driven partly by increased polarization of the two parties and partly by demographic shifts. So, you know, for instance, the distinction between the Electoral College and the popular vote, it's always been there, except usually in American history, they went the same way, right? So then people sort of swept it under the rug. But we've, you know, had a couple elections recently where the popular vote and the Electoral College vote, you know, were at odds with one another. And given demographics and the geographical division between where the parties, you know, have power, it looks like that'll become more and more common. And just to give you, you know, one quote, and, you know, again on the Senate, but this relates to the Electoral College in a way as well. David Birdsall, a political scientist from Baruch College, had an estimate that by 2040, 70% of Americans will live in the 15 largest states, which means 70% of Americans will have 30 senators, right? And 30% of Americans will have 70 senators. So again, you know, the Senate has always been unequal in its representation, but the problem is getting worse now, right, because of demographics.
Yeah, exactly. If I can add to that, I mean, basically, the reason why the Electoral College and the popular vote come apart is that the country is ever more segregated politically. And so the biggest states have a lot of Democrats, and the biggest states have 2 senators, like Dan said. The smallest states are where the Republicans are, and the smallest states have 2 senators. And it magnifies itself into the Electoral College because it means that these Republican states are overrepresented. So everyone knows that the popular vote doesn't determine the presidential election. And kind of the remarkable thing, both from that Bush v. Gore contest in 2000 and from the Trump election victory 4 years ago, is that people accept it, you know, even though the popular vote would have picked a different candidate. Americans overwhelmingly believe that those are the rules, you know. Now, the question is whether Trump will believe that those are the rules this year if he loses. And so he's been just teeing up this tension, which always surrounds presidential elections, because we never know if they're going to run well. And there's so many reasons why they don't already, even before Trump. And he's been pushing on all of those weaknesses of the system and magnifying what were pre-existing problems. So our real concern now is that he really won't abide by the election. And, you know, he's hired a huge number of lawyers already to challenge a lot of rules before the election. But what we're even more worried about are these post-election challenges, in which the idea is just to drag out the certification of the electors so that the Electoral College will get all gummed up, so that the election will get thrown to the House of Representatives, where he's guaranteed to win. And that procedure has never been used before. Well, actually, it's been used once before, but more than 100 years ago. So people aren't used to that procedure. And the worry is, if all the rules get followed, will people go along with it if Trump is elected by the House of Representatives without winning solidly either the Electoral College or the popular vote? So it's probably a remote possibility, but there are lots of people gaming that out now. And that's why I think a lot of us are just really nervous about this. The system isn't designed for this level of lack of confidence in it, drummed up by one of the candidates.
Perhaps now we can introduce a couple of the kind of concrete questions that we received from the audience. We have Thomas Carney, who asks, well, how should Democrats respond to the continued twisting and ignoring of the rules, precedents, and norms by the GOP? And then we have Martin Lemstra, who says, if the US presidency was truly decided by a one-person, one-vote system, for example, by removing the Electoral College, how do you predict the parties would adjust to that new situation? Would, for example, the GOP radically change their policies? And then we have a third question, which asks, in reference to the possibility that's been discussed that Republican state representatives in the chaos following the elections in the state of Pennsylvania should choose electoral representatives that they think reflect the state's vote. Do you believe that such a scenario could actually come to pass?
Yeah, maybe I could take a couple of those. What the Democrats do in the current system, what they always do, is they mount these massive get out the vote campaigns. Voter registration, get out the vote. So you see, you know, that what they do is they try to overcome it by just sheer numbers, just making the victories so big that they can't be contested. But again, the Democrats are fighting uphill. They have to get at least 3, preferably 5, almost, you know, and they can only certainly win the Electoral College if they have 7 or 8% more of the popular vote nationally for president. And in the House of Representatives, there's also a similar skew because of gerrymandering, which is a different problem. So essentially, the Democrats accept the rules, and they accept that they have to get not just a simple majority, but 3, 5, 7% more than a simple majority, because the rules are so hard to change. If the Electoral College were to be abolished, and actually it requires a constitutional amendment, which is unlikely. So there's instead another proposal that's on the table called the National Vote Compact, which is quite ingenious. It requires legislatures, state legislatures, because remember I showed you that constitutional language that said it's up to the state legislatures how to choose electors. And actually before the Civil War, the state legislatures would just vote the electors by themselves. And we have several states that are threatening to do that with this election. Like, you know, if there's widespread, quote, voter fraud, which I put in quotes because usually it's not real, but if there is an allegation of widespread voter fraud, which is something they're teeing up now to do in Pennsylvania, for example, the state legislatures are now claiming they can just vote electors for their preferred presidential candidate. And right now, state legislatures in 36 out of the 50 states are dominated by Republicans. So if that happens, you're going to get Republican slates of electors, and then there's going to be this challenge, and then you run into that timeline I showed you. So there's a lot of chaos that's going to happen. So what would happen, you know, with this national vote compact? The idea is to get electors, is to get legislatures. And if you just get legislatures that would account for 270 electoral votes, that's how many you need to win. If states equivalent to that number of electoral votes passed a law that said we will have our presidential election in our state, but then the state legislature will direct that all the state's electors are assigned to whoever won the national popular vote, right? So the state electors get pledged to the national vote winner rather than to the state vote winner. If states that have 270 electors do that, then the popular vote and the Electoral College vote will always track each other. And before this election, we've now got states that add up to 235 electors that have already passed that national vote compact. And we just couldn't get the last states in place for 2020. But that's more likely than a constitutional amendment because it's a lot easier. But of course, the Republicans have said they will challenge that as soon as it goes into effect. So there'll be endless litigation, and this is where, as many of you will see, because it's hard to avoid following American news no matter where you are in the world, there's currently before the Senate a candidate who will join the Supreme Court almost surely because the Republicans are pushing her through before they lose the Senate. And that Supreme Court will get to rule on all these cases. And it's ever since the early 1980s, the Supreme Court has always ruled in favor of Republicans on every single vote challenge. You don't even have to know the substance of what it is. That's how they've always voted, and that will get even worse. So we're kind of stuck with this Republican bias in the system right now, and it's hard to know how to overcome it.
Yeah, so Alex, I guess I should chime in as well. I'm glad Kim talked about the National Popular Vote Compact because that was something I wanted to mention, and that's one of the key avenues of reform. Again, one of your questioners asked, how should Democrats respond? And I think in addition to that reform of the Electoral College that Kim mentioned, I think eliminating the filibuster is something that I think Democrats need to do if they get a majority in the Senate. I mean, even normally eliminating the filibuster, and the filibuster basically means that you need 60 votes in the Senate, to get anything passed. And normally you would need a supermajority to get rid of it, but they could kind of break a norm, so to speak, and just do it with their simple majority. So I think they should get rid of the filibuster. And I think then with that gotten rid of, they need to pass much stronger voting rights legislation. And essentially they need to try to circumvent some of the rulings that the Supreme Court has made, like the Shelby County. Oh, I think we lost Kim.
Nope, I'm still here. I'm just trying to correct my lighting.
Okay. Well, anyway, taking into account what Kim was saying about the role the Supreme Court has had in kind of suppressing voting rights, I think Democrats, if they get control of Congress and the executive, really need to push for new, strong legislation that can kind of get around that. There's this pending, what they're calling the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. That needs to be passed. You can do things like make elections a national holiday, facilitate early voting in different ways. And then there's other things we could talk about, moves they should do, like ending partisan gerrymandering, et cetera. Now, one of the other questions you put to us from one of the listeners was, if elections were eventually decided by a national popular vote, so let's say if this compact Kim was talking about got put into place, how would that change strategies? Well, that would change things profoundly. because the way it is now, the parties just focus on this handful of swing states, right? They focus all their campaigning, all their energy there, and it leads to these gross inequalities where basically if you live in a state that is clearly going to go majority Democrat or Republican, no one pays attention to you, that sort of thing. So yeah, I guess I think that kind of answers the question put to us. I'm trying to see, was there one other?
Yeah, if I can just add, I think there was one about what would happen if, there was really one person, one vote. And one thing that happens, Dan is in Pennsylvania. I'm in New Jersey. We live about, 25 miles apart?
Yeah, but my vote counts and yours doesn't.
Exactly. And Dan is being drowned in campaign ads because Pennsylvania is a battleground state. And so all the parties have dumped tons of resources. And I'm in New Jersey, which is safely Democratic. It's almost like there's no election going on here. So one thing you'd see are national campaigns, national elections, national strategies, as opposed to these battleground states versus all those of us who are left out.
And I mean, I should add, of course, the defense you'll hear from defenders of the Electoral College, I find rather bizarre, but they would say, well, it's only because of the Electoral College that national campaigns pay attention to some, less populous states.
Yeah.
Okay, but then again, the point is people should count in a democracy, not square miles, right? And very large states, at large in terms of population, very populous states get completely ignored in the current system, and that wouldn't happen, right? If you went to a national popular vote.
Thank you both. I think all of this kind of gives us a good overview of all the issues at stake. So perhaps we can conclude with two questions. On the one hand, and of course partly you've addressed this, but what would you say? How do we shore up kind of U.S. democracy and the rule of law? What are the big areas that need to be tackled or need to be strengthened in order to make sure that we don't find ourselves in this kinds of circumstances? And on the other hand, perhaps taking a bit more of a bird's eye view, how do you see the state of democracy and the rule of law in the United States kind of fit in this more kind of diffuse malaise that the rule of law and democracy have been facing in the West more generally, both sides of the Atlantic, and of course in other regions like South America? Do you think that some of the drivers behind the rise of populism and autocratic governments are similar? If there are differences, I think it would be very interesting for our audience to kind of hear from you on these kinds of topics.
Okay, maybe you want me to go first this time, Kim?
Yeah, you can go ahead, sure.
Okay, well, look, the biggest, in a sense, the biggest threat in U.S. democracy is that it's hard to make a two-party democratic system work when one of the parties is anti-democratic, okay? And right now, we're in the situation where, I mean, you actually had a sitting U.S. senator the other day put out a tweet, got a lot of attention, saying, democracy is not the goal, prosperity and freedom are the goals. And you're having this debate where, but that reflects the fact that, the entire Republican Party is basically, figuring out that in truly free and fair elections with widespread participation, they're worried they can't win anymore. And this reminds me of Dan Ziblatt, he's most famous for his book with Steve Levitsky on how democracies die, but actually recently wrote another book about how conservative parties are actually key to democracy, whether they, in essence, if conservative parties decide that they can compete fairly and win in sometimes, at least in elections, they'll support democracy. If they think they can't, they'll go for autocracy. And I'm afraid that's the position we're in now, where the Republican Party is increasingly turning against the democratic process itself. So that is truly dangerous in a two-party system. You can have one undemocratic party in a multi-party system and maybe be okay, but not in a two-party system. Now, but here's the thing, how do we deal with that? I don't think appealing to people's conscience or something like that works. Maybe I'm too cynical, but we've seen that it doesn't work, in fact. The only way to change that will be to change the incentives that Republican politicians face, right? And to make it basically be in their interest to have to compete democratically, right? And the only way to do that is to do some of the things we talked about, some of the reforms like the popular vote thing that Kim talked about and others. But again, like ending partisan gerrymandering, right? So we need again, Democrats will have to win on this unfair playing field first, and then once in power, they need to go in there to shore up the rules, to create rules which will force Republicans basically, or give them the incentive to have to compete. So end partisan gerrymandering, push to overcome sort of past Supreme Court precedents on campaign finance, find other, so maybe they can't limit private spending because of Supreme Court precedents, but they could increase public financing and things like that, right, to reduce the role of big money. They need to do those kind of things in order to, shore up the system. And I guess just the very last thing quickly, since I talked about it before, you asked about the background conditions that are behind this. And yes, and certainly many of the same structure, economic, structural, and sociological factors that explain why voters, some voters, even if it's a minority, there's still a substantial bulk of a substantial section of voters that go for this authoritarian kind of appeal. A number of the factors in the US are the same as those we see in many of the European countries and around the world more generally. It's kind of people who see themselves as the losers, again, of globalization, of rising inequality, of social and demographic change. They're afraid of losing their status in established hierarchies. And so they are therefore willing to go for, to support leaders who don't embrace, true pluralist democracy, but instead embrace this kind of, far-right populist appeal where they can claim to be the voice of the people, but not really allow free and fair pluralist democracy.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think there's a couple of lessons of this, American failing experiment for the world. One is that the US has been rigging elections for a long time. We have a well-honed group of election consultants. There are people who specialize in this, both the lawyers who litigate this stuff, but particularly the people who draw districts, who design campaigns. And American election consultants are running elections all over the world, including in the EU. In fact, when Viktor Orban came to power in 2010, he had had 2 failed election campaigns. And then he hired this group of American Republican election consultants who designed his message, who designed his strategy, and who helped him, after Orban was elected in 2010, rig the rules so that the Hungarian election system, which I've written a lot about, and happy to give people all the technical detail if they want, but it looks like the American electoral system, which is that every rule by itself makes sense, but you combine them, and when you combine these rules in Hungary, there's no way for Orban to lose. We now have a system like that in the US where the Republicans have this structural advantage, which doesn't mean they can never lose, but it takes way more for them to lose than for the Democrats to lose. And these American consultants will sell their talents to anybody who wants to figure out how to do that with their election system. So, Americans on the loose are really dangerous. And so if American election consultants are coming to a country near you, you should be very afraid, okay? So we export this stuff. The second thing is that the US used to be a country that said something when other countries started to have democratic failures. And the US would criticize autocrats, and the US would publicize and name and shame and do whatever they could, sometimes even sanctions against countries that had rigged their elections, or where you had strong men who refused to step down and went on endless terms and so on. The U.S. government can't do that anymore. Under Trump, it hasn't wanted to. In fact, rather the opposite, which is the U.S. is supporting almost every autocrat that wants to stay in power forever around the world and has, criticized its democratic allies. But when the U.S., including the U.S.'s weight in international organizations like the Security Council and others, refuses to put its weight behind democratic robustness, then I think it does have an effect on whether other countries are willing to stand up for democratic robustness and whether international organizations can do anything effective about democratic robustness. So I think one of the problems that we see now, and just to take it back to the EU, where I know, the RECONNECT project is fundamentally looking sort of inside the EU, what we see is the EU is starting to look more and more like the United States. And Dan has written a lot about this, which is to say, in the United States, our democratic failures came first at the state level, where there were whole regions of the country that were basically allowed to rig their elections, mostly by suppressing the black vote, but in other ways as well. And the national government put up with it, and put up with it long enough so that what's now happened is that a lot of the contamination that we saw in the US South, particularly around issues of race, because behind a lot of these rules and behind a lot of this anxiety in the US is still the question of race. Republicans know that as long as blacks turn out in big numbers, they will lose. So they are still devoted, and many of their voter suppression efforts are aimed at black people, just as that was true in the South. So here's the EU lesson. If you let this go in the regions, where everybody thinks, oh, we're robust democratic states, eventually that same poison infects the center. Because now what we're seeing is that the tactics at national level are the very same tactics that the racists in the South used to suppress the black vote there. Now all those have been transferred to the national government, and they affect particularly our national presidential elections. So, having a few rule of law violators in your midst, if you're a federation or quasi-federation, is not something to be taken lightly. And I worry, in fact, you can already see it in the EU, where, there was originally a little bit of an outcry about Hungary. Nothing was done. Now everybody's pretending like Hungary is just newly starting. These rule of law reports that the Commission just issued act like Hungary just started this process, as opposed to it started it 10 years ago and it's already over, right? And so the more, especially the EPP, and frankly, especially the CDU in Germany, tolerates this autocracy on the margins, and they tolerate it, because, they don't want to lose power as the EPP, and Hungary is the most reliable big bloc of EPP votes for them, but also because the German car industry depends on cooperative governments in Poland and in Hungary. And Germany is looking the other way. Germany is claiming a very robust democratic system, but you can't claim a democratic system for yourself and not for others, especially if you're yoked together as closely as the EU member states are yoked. And now what we're starting to see, I think, is that German complicity in all of this, and EPP complicity in all of this, and frankly, Commission and even more Council complicity in all of this means that you have a growing number of states that are starting to look like they're engaged in democratic backsliding. And, the EU mechanisms, Article 7 was designed for a system where you have one violating member state. And as soon as you get two, the harshest sanctions are off the table, right? Crazy system, but the EU is very vulnerable to this kind of thing, and we've seen it already in the US.
And Kim, I just want to add something quickly, Alex, to what Kim said. And yeah, and as she said, it's a subject I've been working on a lot. And I would just say that in terms of that infiltration and the proliferation of these regimes and their infiltration of the center, just, think of a couple examples already in the selection, even though it's not the same kind of democratic process or whatever voting process exactly as the US. If we think about the selection of the Commission president, for instance, right, which has to be approved by the European Parliament, already this time we saw that von der Leyen only became president because she got the votes from Fidesz, Orban's party, and from the PIS, the Polish party. right? And they had meetings with her, and basically, it looks very clear to me, she even said after talking with them when they were agreeing to vote with her, that essentially nobody's perfect on rule of law issues, and we want to avoid confrontation and continue dialogue. So, it looks like essentially, in exchange for their votes, they got more or less a kind of commitment to take a soft approach to rule of law. And then just two additional examples of that kind of infiltration. Who did she put in charge of EU enlargement policy, where that's the dossier that handles the promotion of democracy and rule of law in applicant countries? She put a crony of Orban in charge. So that policy, which is the EU's main democracy promotion policy, really worldwide, is enlargement, right? Well, that's become a joke now. And then finally, just a little example that just shows, again, this infiltration. I remember it struck me with the whole, everything about the CEU and the blatant, violation of academic freedom that the Orban regime's expulsion of CEU, demonstrated. The vice chair of the Education Committee in the European Parliament is a Fidesz MEP, right? So again, it shows, and that's just like what happened in the US, where autocratic Southern politicians, because they were around so long and their party, their delegations were powerful, they got seats on key committees in Congress and started to influence US policymaking, right? So there's, now we have, between PIS, Orban's Fidesz, Gerb from Bulgaria, increasingly Jansa's party from Slovenia, and there's others. There's some on the left that are problematic too, like the Maltese party on the left. But I would just say that, increasingly we have, the infiltration of EU institutions by these parties. So sorry, just to underline what Kim's saying.
Yeah, and I might say that, you look at it within the EU, just if I can add one more thing, Poland and Hungary will look at the EU strategically, and they will ensure their people get into all the key positions. And the EU is looking at a lot of different things. It doesn't necessarily see the way that the strategic placement of the folks from the autocratic governments is really going to affect everything about the way the EU operates eventually. And I might say that, it wasn't just that Fidesz and PiS supported von der Leyen, but they actively vetoed Timmermans. If you remember, there was an elite pact to kind of put Timmermans in place. And it was only the EPP's, power in the parliament and the fact that Fidesz was crucial to that blocked Timmermans from going in. And Timmermans was the one who was Mr. Rule of Law. And he's just
so if you're an aspiring if you're a commissioner who aspires to the presidency or something higher, the lesson is if you get tough on these regimes, you're not going to climb the ladder. Right?
Exactly. So, we already see these signs of rot, happening in the EU. And the lesson from the US is that the kinds of problems we see at national level started with autocratic regimes in the South. And they just got exported into the system as a whole. And it's almost impossible to stop that, especially if everybody pretends that all the states are equal and every elected representative is the same. And if people turn a blind eye toward electoral system flaws. So if I can just say, maybe one last thing, I know we're going to run out of time, but so far all the focus in the EU has been on rule of law. And the RECONNECT project and all of us, whenever we talk about this stuff, democracy's gone bad, we talk about rule of law. Well, Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union also says democracy in it. And I'm starting to think about, what do we do now with governments? And Hungary is definitely there already, and Poland is close, where there will be no peaceful transfer of power because the election system is rigged. So far, the EU hasn't thought about that. The answer to the democracy deficit question in the EU has always been, well, we have the parliament and it has more powers than it used to. Of course, it doesn't have as many powers as a real parliament would have in an actual sort of democratic parliamentary system. But the other, constant answer to the democratic deficit question is that the EU is built on the democratic governments of the member states. Well, you already have one system in place where no matter what the voters of Hungary think, it will be hard for them to get rid of Fidesz. Free and fair elections are not possible any longer, and the election system is rigged. So what does the EU do about that? I'm now thinking we need to go beyond the rule of law to thinking about enforcing principles of democracy.
Oh yeah, no, we really need, a much. I mean, there is some EU guidelines on, let's say, European Parliament elections, things like that. But really, I think longer term, you need a sort of EU Voting Rights Act or the equivalent thereof, right?
Right. So that's the next phase, and you see it in the US. So unfortunately, we are your future. Sorry, unless
Well,
you can
hope
get
not.
it off.
Let's hope not.
Learn from our mistakes.
Indeed, indeed. So, Dan, Kim, thank you so much for this fascinating, wide-ranging conversation that started in the US and ended up in the challenges that we're of course also facing in the European Union. I would like to really thank the both of you for joining us today, as well as our audience, of course. If you would like to know more about the RECONNECT project and keep up to date with our webinar series, please follow us on Twitter at RECONNECT.eu and visit our website at reconnect-europe.eu. From Kim, Dan, and myself, it's thank you and goodbye.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.